So I'm going to turn this meeting now over to the co-chair of the Adult Programs Committee, Debbie Dobbins, who along with Nicole Griffin has done an amazing job of with a very, very eager and engaged committee to plan the programs while we were in the pandemic. So Debbie?
Thanks, Lillian. And I'm not sure, did you mention that we're recording this event?
No, I didn't. Would you mention that?
Yes, in case you didn't know, we are being recorded. Yeah, so I just want to give you a little information about Scott. For those of you that don't know, he is a public relations executive and Democratic Party strategist. As a young man, he began his political organizing career with John Anderson's 1980 presidential election. He went on to earn a master's degree from George Washington University in strategic public relations, and he served as press secretary for Senator Kennedy, communications director for Congressman Stephen Lynch, and senior advisor during Congressman Seth Moulton's 2014 campaign. His more recent activities include being part of the communications team for Senator Markey's re-election, the general consultant and comms person for Speaker Mariano, and he's now working with Danielle Allen exploring a run for governor, and Anicia Isabi George running for mayor of Boston. And perhaps you know his firm is the Liberty Square Group, a strategic communications firm. So thank you again, Scott, for providing us with, I know what is going to be a very interesting and informative evening.
Thanks very much for having me, Debbie and Lillian and Ed. Thanks, I appreciate it. I'm gonna go in and, since I'm looking at myself, get onto the gallery view so I can see everybody. And it's great to see a lot of familiar faces, and everyone's looking so great, and some of you vaccinated, which is awesome. And I want to start, I don't want to forget to put in a plug. I run a political incubator for Democratic candidates staffed by college students called the Blue Lab. So if you know any college students who want to learn how to run a campaign, we're accepting applications for the summer semester. We run about a dozen campaigns for first-time female and minority candidates for office. And I'm going to start by talking about one of those people who we helped to elect. But just to frame it out, you know, I think a lot of us have a sense of what is going on now politically. You know, I can't really watch CNN or anything anymore. It just drives me crazy in terms of the way that they're portraying everything. So I thought we could take sort of a historical view on the particular time that I think we find ourselves in, because there are historic roadmarks that I think will help frame out what's going on now, because it is unique and something that we haven't seen play out since 1968, and before that, 1932. So there's a particular tectonic shift in political parties that I think gets completely missed, whether you're watching Fox News or whether you're watching CNN or whether you're doing anything else. So we can talk about that. But I want to start with a contrasting story about democracy. Debbie mentioned I am the Speaker Mariano, who just passed the climate bill today in the House, is a client of mine. 2 days ago came out publicly in favor of driver's licenses for undocumented immigrants. I think people are going to be pleasantly surprised by Speaker Mariano, and I'm part of his team. But when they swore in the new session of the House, because of COVID, they let just the freshmen on the House floor at the State House, and I was standing sort of in the vestibule, kind of watching this go on, and a woman came up the grand staircase by herself, because you couldn't, if you were being sworn in, you couldn't bring anybody. And I recognized her as Brandy Fluker Oakley, who's the incoming representative from Boston, who the Blue Lab had helped to elect. And as she came in, she sort of nodded. I said, "Congratulations, Representative." And she went and she sat down on the floor. And I know this is sort of a small thing, but I appreciated it. She, at some point, came out and she looked at me and she said, "Can you tell me where the restroom is?" And I said, "Sure, Representative. There are specific restrooms for the members. It's right down here, and you can use the members' restroom is down the hall." And it was that small moment of kind of democracy of somebody being elected who holds power, who walked in from the street and assumed her seat to be sworn in, that I just thought was really powerful. And then, of course, I left there after that ceremony and got in my car and turned on the radio and heard of what was happening in Washington on January 6th. And the contrast of what was going on around the US Capitol and what I had just witnessed on the floor of the Massachusetts House of Representatives is maddening, but also shows you how volatile the period that we're in. So with that, I'll pause in the middle, but we'll go back and sort of refresh us on the history lessons specifically focused on these changes in the political party systems. Pause there, and then sort of lay out a couple of things that I see are dynamics that are kind of happening now. And that's the part we can really have a conversation, but I'm happy to take questions along the way. And I think I'll start with the fact that there are two constants in American history, in our 245-year history. We basically can handle two parties. That's what we can absorb. Sure, I started out my political life working for John Anderson. That was my windmill to tilt that. I love John Anderson and the third party movement, but they're not, history shows that they're not really sustainable here. We always, when we break apart and these forces that are outside the two existing parties start to play, they just reconstitute themselves into two parties. And we do that every generation or so. And it's driven by the tectonic shift of events, war, economic collapse, these things. I would say that the one we're in is harder to understand because we're not looking at it through the lens of history. We're living in it now, and it seems more complicated, weirdly to say, than like the Civil War or the Great Depression. There's a lot more forces at play. And we've been through really only the second revolution in the history of the world, the technology revolution, second only to the introduction of the steam engine in terms of physical distance. So that's also at play too. So with that, let's take a quick stroll through history. So our Constitution, it doesn't mention parties, right? And the hope with a tight knit of elitists, of propertied white men, a number of them slaveholders, was that the power would be preserved with the group, and that your self-interest would be transformed into your civic interest, and your civic interest would look out for the rest of us. That people who were well versed in the way that a democracy should be run, this experiment at the time, 245 years ago, would be able to create a union that would be democratic, but not too democratic. And they certainly didn't envision that we would have competing factions, these fights, because then you always ran the risk that it might open itself up to, I don't know, actual democracy. And so that was frowned upon. And so and of course, when they were writing Article 2 about the executive, they even had a person in mind. They knew it was going to be George Washington. So they set up this ideal in terms of who it would be, with the hope that there would be a succession, which was unprecedented as well. So the founders were afraid of inclusive suffrage, even of unpropertied white men. So the checks and the balances again and again between the three branches, in the branches, between the Senate and the House, between the interplay, the checks and balances of having the state legislatures approve who the senators were, saying we care about the people's house, and we're going to put that in Article 1, the legislature, but we're going to put checks on that as well, they felt was pretty tight. But of course, we've all seen Hamilton, so we all know what happened. And immediately the struggle between the haves and have-nots, the elite and the rabble, those in power and those out of power, the landed and the left behind, natives and immigrants, the poor versus the rich, us versus them, were ripe for division. And if you're fighting over power in a growing country, you will start to use those forces for your own political purposes. And it happened almost immediately. We model our system on the British system, but we wished to avoid the factional fighting that the Parliament presented. So the idea was this: to take that model, but to put the ideal into it. But of course, as we know, in 1800, the pitched battle that had started 4 years before, when Jefferson challenged Adams for the presidency after George Washington, came to a head. And the battle was epic, even through the lens of history. Jefferson prevailing, it needed an adjustment in the way that we elected both the president and the vice president. We learned that in the election of 1800. But the most stunning thing about that fight between the Democrat Republicans, or the Republicans as they were known, and the Federalists of Washington and Adams, was that power was actually transferred. That for the first time in the history of the world, a peaceful transition from one faction to another happened. It's remarkable. And when you think about it back in the day, that, and we talk about Donald Trump not attending his successor's inauguration. It's happened twice before in American history. And I'm proud to say, as a proud son of Massachusetts, that they were both presidents from Massachusetts who refused to attend their successor's inauguration, John Quincy Adams and John Adams. And John Adams, of course, it being the first time that power had been transferred from one party, if you will, to another, there was no precedent about this peaceful transition that they would do in person. And so John Adams woke up at 3 o'clock in the morning on March 4th and hailed a stagecoach and took it to Baltimore, leaving the White House for Thomas Jefferson to find after he was sworn in. But the power was transferred. And that experiment of American democracy worked the first time. And it has since. Almost not this last time, but it has ever since. So, with that power shift, what we also find in these, so that's the first political party structure in the United States, if you will, the period between 1792 and 1824, with the epic battle again between John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson. And what you find is that they start with stark differences. The Jeffersonian model of agrarian democracy, the decentralization of government to the people, the acceptance of slavery in the southern states, the thought that maybe the country was too big physically and eventually would have to be broken up and we would have all of these states, versus the Hamiltonian Adams Washington sense of a strong centralized government. One that it seems, in retrospect, obviously, to be prevalent in terms of being able to hold as a union together. And this fight, of course, then Jefferson gets in and doubles the size of the country, and engages in a lot of nationalist expansion of executive power, as every president has done since that time of Washington. And so by the time you get through the 1810s of the War of 1812 and the administration of James Madison and James Monroe, you get into this, with James Monroe, this era of good feeling. Almost no opposition, no political opposition, just this country was back to maybe even the vision that the founders in Washington put out for it. Washington in his farewell address talking about the concern with factions and the need to avoid that. And here we are in this era of good feeling and growth of the country with James Monroe. The Federalists have largely disappeared by this point, and it's impossible to kind of distinguish between different factions. But then, of course, with this expansion across the country, with the start of the industrialization, with the growth of cities along the coast and trade and trading partners overseas, and the frontier and the pioneers on the frontier, and the difference of the way that you live if you're in Kentucky or Tennessee as you do if you're in Boston or Philadelphia, the rifts then show again, and they're brought to a head by the election of 1824 with the corrupt bargain of Andrew Jackson winning the popular vote, but not a majority in the Electoral College, and for the first time the election being thrown to the House of Representatives, where in the corrupt bargain of John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay, the election is thrown to John Quincy Adams, and he immediately appoints Henry Clay Secretary of State. And for the population that voted for Jackson, there's this sense, maybe this is an echo for us, that there is this corruption in Washington, that the power structure have kept the people out of the process. And there's even conspiracy theories about Masonics and an anti-Masonic party, and the fact that there's a cabal that's conspiring to take over the country. And these anti-Masonic tickets start to gain traction in certain states. And eventually, in 1828, with the rematch, Andrew Jackson prevails, and it's the start of the Democratic Party and the second political party system in the country. And all of those anti-forces against the Republican Party, or the Democratic Republican Party, coalesce in the Democratic Party. And then the forces on the losing side, the sort of the remnants of John Adams and the Federalists up in New England and other parties, start to coalesce and be the opposition to the Democrats. And we have that party system through the Civil War. And the fight largely there in the second party system is over slavery. Northern Democrats, a lot of immigrant Catholics sympathetic to the Southern cause. Whigs divided North and South because, of course, it's this collection of people who've come together to oppose Jeffersonian democracy, his opposition to the National Bank, the other things that constitute the Jacksonian presidency, sort of coalesce in Whigs, which is this amalgamation of Whigs in the South who support slavery, and Whigs in the North who are abolitionists and anti-slavery people in the western part of the country. Abraham Lincoln, not enough to be able to help to be able to be elected over Stephen Douglas to the United States Senate. And in fact, when he runs for president, he almost loses the city of Springfield. So it's this shifting shape as they go through the early 1800s, all completely, though, bogged down in the question and the fight over slavery between the Southern Democrats and the Northern, and the faction of the Northern Whigs, with the Southern Whigs kind of hanging out there. And we find that. Continued expansion, war with Mexico, the sense of manifest destiny, of this Americanism that we have, fight over admission to the states. Jackson pays off the debts. A lot of the big substantive problems that we might have now in terms of the moving of economy, we didn't have then. Free land, expansive, Napoleon is defeated. We don't have the same concerns that we do from our neighbors across the Atlantic Ocean. But inevitably, we know that because of slavery, we're going to come to this reckoning. I always think with Theodore Parker, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. I love his next line: things refuse to be mismanaged long. Jefferson trembled when he knew that there would be a reckoning on slavery. I love that line from Theodore Parker in the original, quoted correctly by Martin Luther King. And he says this, and you sort of think, how is this possible that in this long slog over slavery, things refuse to be mismanaged long? But the reckoning came, and it came with the collapse of the Whigs not being able to sustain this party that was both supportive of slaves in the South and abolitionists in the North. And Lincoln emerges in a four-way contest. And when you talk about the shift into the third political party system, which then lasts up through 1896, I look at Lincoln's first and second inaugural addresses. As a communications person, they're a master force in persuasion, in political persuasion. In his first, he makes it very clear. I think he's speaking in his first and his second to a particular audience, the Southern audience. And in the first one, he's very clear. I do not have the power to abolish this institution. That is not my intent. I am not your enemy. I am here to figure this out and preserve the Union. And after 655,000 battle deaths in those 4 years, he stands there again on the east front of the Capitol to give his second inaugural address with his assassin in the audience. And he says to the Southern, he says, let me tell you what we just went through. This was a struggle over the abolition of slavery. And he completely reframes it from his first inauguration. In the second, he's more truthful, if you will, to the situation, but less truthful in what he was trying to do 4 years ago and what he was doing then. And he completely reframes the folding the country, knitting the country back together. And he is indicating to the South that there will be Reconstruction, that we both shared a God, and none of us can fully claim him. Both of us do, but none of us can fully claim him. And if God's judgment visited 240 more years of strife on us, that was just. And so it was this appeal to be able to come back together. But he very starkly kind of lays it out. And he also sets it up for that third political party system, the dominant Republican Party, the party that saved the Union, the party that freed the slaves, the party that knit the country back together. And you find for the first time this period where there is intense party loyalty and a high degree of voting. The voter turnout that we just had in 2020 was the highest since, I think, 1892, when it was slightly higher as a percentage. So just this intense participation in the voting process, very, very strongly for the Republican Party in the North and the Democratic Party in the South after Reconstruction. The Democrats managed to win 2 elections in this period of time, Grover Cleveland in 1884 and Grover Cleveland in 1892. But to echo where we are now, the parties were so evenly divided nationally that the Democrats actually, by popular vote, won 2 other elections. Grover Cleveland beating Benjamin Harrison in 1888, Harrison winning, though, in the Electoral College, and Rutherford B. Hayes winning the Electoral College in 1876 over Samuel Tilden from New York, called the corrupt bargain. Was that called a corrupt bargain? One of them was called a corrupt bargain, by basically saying that the southern states that were in dispute on electoral votes would throw their votes to the Republican if they would hasten, if Rutherford B. Hayes would hasten the Reconstruction, and Reconstruction ended during the Hayes administration, and set the stage for race relations in the South for a generation since then. But it also solidified in place the parties, the Democrats in the South and the Republicans in the North. The demise of the Democratic Party during that era was the fight, this internal fight, and again, we're going to talk about that a little bit in terms of where we are, between the populists in the Democratic Party and the Democratic establishment of people like Grover Cleveland and other leaders. Cleveland in his second term was met with fights over the tariff and the Panic of 1893, which plunged the country into economic collapse. I love the wording too, right? Panic, it's a panic. So therefore, the next time it came around, we didn't want to say it was a panic. It was just a depression. It wasn't a panic. Don't panic, it's just a depression. And of course, after that, we can't use depression anymore. So it's just a recession. Don't worry, it's just a recession. And after that, it's it's just a down blip in economic indicators. Don't worry, it's just a downturn in economic indicators. But in 1893, it was a panic. I think John Kenneth Galbraith he's the one who laid that all out. But we had that, and with that, with the tariff fights, with the fight over free money and silver, the gold standard and free silver, William Jennings Bryan comes into the Democratic Convention in 1896, the 36-year-old congressman from Nebraska, and takes it by storm with the Cross of Gold speech. We will not sacrifice this on a cross of gold. And he captures the Democratic nomination in 1896, a la Bernie Sanders, if you will. And they storm out of there and lose big time to William McKinley and the Republicans, who hold sound money and the gold standard. And McKinley comes in running for that first time a real sophisticated campaign, what we would call a sophisticated campaign, one with a lot of external communications, a lot of what we would now call grassroots organizing through Republican clubs. He gave a lot of speeches and sort of changed the era. If William McKinley came in and sort of campaigned in this way, of course, followed by Teddy Roosevelt, who would say to William McKinley, "Hold my beer. Let me show you what I can do and get out there." But it ushered in this kind of era of engagement in the political system that we had not seen ever before. And of course, with the Spanish-American War, with the expansion and the internationalism at the time, with the Gilded Age and the industrialization, with the issues around labor issues and suffrage and prohibition and the things that start to happen, populism, muckrakers who start to investigate the conditions of working men and women and children, all these start to play. Social issues that hadn't gone into play before all start to get in. And William James Bryan is nominated twice, again, in the re-election for William McKinley in 1900 when he loses, and then in 1908 he loses to William Howard Taft when Teddy Roosevelt decides not to run for re-election. And so we've got, at that point, really a second era of Republican dominance from McKinley through Hoover, with one interruption, one Democratic interruption, much the same as we did before with Cleveland with Woodrow Wilson's 2 terms. And really only because of the 3-way contest in 1912 with William Howard Taft and the Bull Moose Party of Teddy Roosevelt, where William Howard Taft, the Republican incumbent president, comes in 3rd in the 3-way contest. And Wilson wins with a minority number of the votes and gets reelected by a very narrow margin, only because he's the president who kept us out of war, out of World War I. And so he beats Charles Evans Hughes, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, or the governor of New York, who later became Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And I'll tell you this one story about Charles Evans Hughes that I love. He went to bed that night thinking that he had won. And Wilson went to bed thinking that he had lost. And when they woke up, a reporter called Charles Evans Hughes's hotel room and asked if he could speak to him. And Charles Evans Hughes' secretary said, "The president is sleeping." And the reporter said, "Well, when he wakes up, tell him he's not president." And but other than that interruption of Woodrow Wilson, and of course the continuation of international expansion that was started with the Spanish-American War and the expansion of Teddy Roosevelt, World War I, the efforts of Herbert Hoover on relief after World War I, just this giddy expansion of the economy driven by really no Democratic opposition and a strong Republican Party, of course, until it all comes crashing down in 1929. And then in the 5th political party system, ushered in by Roosevelt, it is a position of dominance of the Democrats, winning 32, 36, 40, 44, 48, with only the interruption in kind of a mirror image of the previous 2 party systems with Wilson and with Cleveland, this time with Eisenhower. So you've got a hardening of the Republicans into 2 factions, one headed by Robert Taft and the conservatives, anti-interventionist, fiscal conservative, son of the late president. And you've got sort of the internationalists in the Republican Party, led by Thomas Dewey and sort of the elites in the urban centers. So what we would consider today to be sort of the remnants of that liberal Republican Party, the Mitt Romneys of the world. Eisenhower, of course, is not a political figure at all. And so after the reaction to the New Deal and the Square Deal inevitably happen after Roosevelt and Truman, you have this period of calm interlude, if you will, with Dwight Eisenhower, before you get the New Frontier and Kennedy coming in. So with and with each one, you either see sort of the death knell of the party. So it starts off as a result of something enormous or tragic: the Civil War, the Great Depression, the economic, the panic of 1893. There's something that precipitates the new change, and everyone sort of splits apart into different factions, each with their own kind of tribe, and they come together because one becomes dominant, and therefore you need the others to coalesce in some almost dominant fashion. Not the party in power yet, but the one that sees its way forward. And that's the way it's always been. And then as you go through and there's success of that political party system, things calm down, and it's harder to distinguish between the two of them. So it's harder to distinguish with Eisenhower and Kennedy what the differences are. Kennedy's the one who cuts the top income bracket tax rate from 91%. And you sort of start to see those come together, and it requires then another tectonic shift of plates to be able to upset everything. And of course, in the 60s, it's easier for us to kind of remember all of those. The war in Vietnam, the shift on civil rights, the Southern strategy of Richard Nixon, those things, the assassinations, the enfranchisement, women's vote, young people voting, all of these things coming together volatilely and coming to a head in 1968. And when you've got Richard Nixon coming in, sort of ushering a new era, you've got sort of the Democratic Party very much on the outside trying to understand how to remake itself. And George McGovern famously said after 68, the best way to get democracy is more democracy. And the Democrats start to open up the process for the party and for welcoming people in and inclusion. And the Republicans in their own way do that too. The forces of Ronald Reagan, in a way that Barry Goldwater wasn't successful in achieving power, figure out a way through Nixon to do this. He's shifted the electoral map to what we kind of recognize today, where it's increasingly the Democrats in the coasts and in the urban centers amongst communities of color, particularly African-American communities of color. And you've got Republican strongholds in this strong electoral hold that they have right now on the country. It's stunning for me to even think in this sixth political party system that we're living in, that the Democratic nominee has won 7 of the last 8 elections by the popular vote. 7 of the last 8 elections. The last election a Democrat lost in the popular vote was 2004. So again, as a proud son of Massachusetts, if the 2 people from Massachusetts refused to go to their successor's inauguration and kind of making a statement, the last 2 Democrats to lose the popular vote for president were both from Massachusetts, John Kerry and Michael Dukakis. But the Democrats have won the last 7. So we're in this period now where the Democrats don't have an election problem. In the past 4 elections, the Democrat has won 25 million more votes than the Republican nominee when you add it all up. And we've won 7 of the last 8 elections by the popular vote. We have an electoral problem, electoral college problem. And that's why you see a lot of call for a lot of change in these systems that we can talk about. But right now, I would say that the sixth political party system died in 2016 when you had both parties almost nominate, one did and one almost did, nominate people who don't belong to the party. Donald Trump is not a Republican. Not quite sure, well, I have a better sense of what he is now than what I thought he was at the time, but he's not a Republican. And Bernie Sanders is an actual socialist. And the Democratic Party almost nominated Bernie Sanders, and the Republican Party nominated Trump. Those are 2 parties that are just shells of themselves at that point. And I think if we thought about it, we would think that the differences between the parties are very stark. But when you think about it in terms of what they believe, not who they believe, but what they believe, it's very hard to kind of think about it. Because do Republicans think that spending is bad? Apparently not. And it's hard to kind of know where everybody is. And it's been dominated over the past 50 years by a polarization on social issues. And that's really what makes us, if I'm a Democrat or I'm a Republican, it's probably in a lot of fundamental ways because of where I stand on those social issues and not on the economic issues. And I'm struck, I've read several articles where people talk about, and I'll pause after this, where people talk about, the differences between the parties. And I think for those of us who are active and watch it a lot, it makes sense to us. But I would say that it's the difference between, if you go back 70 years ago, I looked at Kathy Carpenter for this, and the Unitarians and the Universalists talked about their differences, and I bet they felt them very strongly. And for the rest of us, we wouldn't know the difference between a Unitarian and a Universalist. And so for the broad swath of voters out there, or people looking at it, they don't get that either. And we can't understand why somebody could vote for Barack Obama and then vote for Donald Trump and then vote for Joe Biden. But there are a lot of people who did that. And if we try to rationalize the reasons why they did that, what made you hop from one to the other, that's not the way they're looking at it at all. And so the system is over that was started with the Southern strategy of Nixon in '68 and the inclusion, the shift on civil rights and the inclusion of people in the Democratic Party. And now what we have, as we kind of always do with presidential politics, sort of a personality cult. Donald Trump, Barack Obama, Bill Clinton, Ronald Reagan. These are people who were with them. They're a Reagan Democrat. They're a Reagan Republican. They're an Obama Democrat. They're a Trump Republican. So just for a palate cleansing 4 years, Joe Biden is not the future of the Democratic Party. I frankly think it's unfair to ask an 82-year-old man in 3 years to serve another term. And he's not transformational. He was elected president because of Donald Trump, because of the threat to the country. Republicans won down ballot. Donald Trump lost not because of what he said. I frankly think if he didn't have other issues, he would have won, because the country largely is with them, at least enough right on that edge. We would have won the popular vote, but we would have lost the Electoral College, because I think that's where we were. But he lost because of who he is. And so now we've got Joe Biden, who I think very early in, 3 months in, could go down as one of the best presidents we've ever had, because I think he sees what he needs to do and what his job is. And it's not to lead the movement for the next 30 years for the Democratic Party. It's to make the country, help the country survive and heal and get back to normal. That said, the $1.9 trillion economic bill, the biggest federal infusion of money since the New Deal, has the ability to be transformative. And it may be why the Republicans had to hold fast on it, but we can talk about different theories about that. With that, I'll pause and then I'll frame out a couple of things to think about, and then we can have the discussion, if that makes sense.
We're all taking a deep breath now.
I'm sorry, I talk fast.
No, it's okay. We've held our breath because we've learned so much in this short period of time. But I think this is your opportunity now to jump into this. There are some things there are some questions in the chat. I don't know whether any of you have a question right now or whether we should go to the chat. Scott, have you looked at the chat questions?
Nope.
We could start. I'm looking to see if there's anything that's pertinent to what you just said.
Yeah, I mean, so Eloise, the Republican Party is an organized conspiracy for the purposes of maintaining power for self-interest in the donor class. So I would say this. I don't disagree with that, but I think too that you have to look at. You know, when I worked on Seth Moulton's campaign, I wanted Seth Moulton to beat John Tierney. We were the outsiders and the agitators, if you will. And now that Seth Moulton is a congressman, I don't want anybody to beat Seth Moulton. So once you're either on the outside or you have power. And if you have power, you don't want to give up power. And I think we don't, I'm a Democrat, and I don't think it's smart for me to look past the entrenchment of power in Washington, Republican and Democrat. There's no one down there who wants to give it up easily. In fact, in their both ways, they both have histories, the Republican more recent and more blatant in terms of voter suppression, but there wasn't a lot of effort for voter inclusion that wasn't going to work for me if I were a Democrat, or me if I were going to work for a Republican. And I think that's a problem. You know, I sort of a little bit, you know, get upset when people talk about the need to take money out of politics, because there are ways that you could do that. But ultimately, what the Democrats and the Republicans are saying is, we don't hate money. We hate your money. We don't hate my money. And, you know, Democrats raise as much, I mean, it's an obscene amount of money that is being raised all around on these races. So I would just say that I agree, Eloise, with that, but that I also don't think we should let Democrats off the hook in terms of what they're doing. And in fact, when Democrats have been dominant, they haven't been sort of into a whole bunch of power sharing.
Scott, that was actually from Bob McGod. I don't want to.
Oh, okay. Well, I agree with Bob then too.
Anyone have any questions that are not in the chat? I think you've stunned them into silence. I see Alice shaking her head. You know, I think we're all, we're not sure how to frame the questions.
Vaccinated Jean.
Jean.
So Scott, who do you think are the people who, well, first, I mean, I think that Biden is doing an amazing job in terms of, you know, the diversity in this cabinet. So I think that, you know, he's, you know, that's a real step forward that he's been able to do. So I think that's great. So who do you think are the leaders, you know, moving forward, or looking at, you know, 2022? I mean, really the cards are where we're looking already at 2022, and what do we have to do, you know, to hold on for them? And who's going to, you know, we got Stacey Abrams that's doing it, but, you know, who else are going to be the leaders that are going to help get us over, you know, to keep that momentum?
Yeah, I mean, it's right that, so it'll be, I mean, obviously historically, midterm elections, the party not in power picks up seats. I have no reason to believe that that's not going to be the case here. I mean, essentially we've got in this, we've got four parties, if you will. So we've got Donald Trump, and then we've got Marco Rubio, if you will, who is doing his best to reach out to Latino communities of color in a certain way. I don't see that they're making any traction on the progress of an immigration bill, for instance. And you've got Donald Trump, who's got this clamp hold on it. And back to Bob's point about just entrenched power, they're so deathly afraid not of losing a general election, but in a primary, that they've got to figure out how they do that. And I think Mitch McConnell's trying to figure that out too. And then what they become. But on the Democratic side, we've got this right now, it's sort of set up as a fight of, because 5% of people in both parties control sort of the process of who elects a president, who gets nominated. That's who votes in these primaries historically. It tends to be the people who are sort of on the extreme. I don't mean that in a pejorative way, but you're motivated to go vote, as opposed to just a you know, sort of a centrist voter, if you will, or somebody who's observing it and wants to vote in the election. So we tend to nominate on both the Republican and Democratic side people who don't fit the district. And in fact, we did that. We lost some seats where we nominated people for seats in primaries that were wildly out of touch with where the district is. So in both parties, they do that. So, you know, you're always going to have your Marjorie Taylor Greens, you know, and there's nothing we can sort of do about that, but we were losing in districts in Nebraska and in Oklahoma and in South Carolina where we shouldn't have. And so I think we've got to do a better part of that. But I would say that I think Biden this is where I think this will work well in 2022. He's just putting cash in people's pockets. And I have this, I told the story the first time I did, I'll tell it again, that Sherrod Brown, the senator from Ohio, said, when you lose a job, the first thing to go is the dog, because dogs are expensive. And when you close the door behind the dog and you turn around and you tell your kids that the dog ran away, that's what people are facing. And if you're facing that, I don't care if you're poor and in Ohio, if you're poor and in your city, or if you're the Mahmoud family that we all helped, who are here. When you're here, we visit these petty humiliations on poor people all the time. And I will, if I'm in that situation, I think I'll take a false promise over nothing every time. And so in 2016, 2020, I think a lot of people did that. And in fact, Diane Hessen, who's brilliant marketing communications person who followed Trump and Clinton voters for 2016, writes for the Boston Globe, and she's about to come out with a book on her experience of talking with these voters. She says that the collapse of Hillary Clinton in the states that she should have carried but lost was when she called voters deplorable. Now we could say, oh, well, some of them are, you know, and she wasn't really talking about that. Well, that's not the way they were hearing it. They were hearing that Hillary Clinton was calling people like them deplorable, and people who would have voted for her, but that's what they were hearing. And so if that's the case, and I'm not given something in a positive way, and it's sort of the message I'm getting is you should move. There's nothing here for you. Is not even the language we use. We talk about retraining people. When I think any one of us, if we were told that we've all been retrained, we all know how to use Zoom. No one ever said, Scott, you need to be retrained. It's just, let me show you, let's figure out how to do Zoom. And so even the language that we use in talking to people who are marginalized, no matter where they are, is something that we have to address. And Joe Biden just put checks in their pocket for the first time in a while, and for the first time in a strong statement from a Democrat. And I think that if played is the wrong word, if managed correctly in terms of a continuation of doing it, can be very powerful. So I think in 2022, Democrats win if we frame it very much as an economic discussion, an economic fight. If we frame it as a you know, and I work for Ed Markey, but what I would like Ed Markey to do is talk about climate in a way that weaponizes it for job creation. That he, rather than talking about it, if I'm there and I don't get the message about saving the planet, but I get the message that a transformed economy, green economy, could give me a job, I'm going to be much more receptive to that argument. And we have to start talking that way.
So that last question in the, there are two questions in here, but the last one, I'm going backwards, but Bob, do you want to ask this question? Bob McGaw?
Yellow up here wants the question.
You asked the question.
Okay, do you want me to ask it? Okay, Scott, is seeking bipartisan support for anything a fool's errand?
If you can, if you can pass it without them, sure. I think, you know, like if the idea is to pass it, I mean, I'm sitting someplace and I get a $1,400 check or a $5,000 check with the kids or whatnot. I'm not going to say, I don't know if I'm going to cash this because it wasn't done in a bipartisan fashion. So I think it's stuff that people again in media love to talk about because it's very convenient to talk about it, as opposed to going out and talking to people and finding out how they're going to behave when they do this in this way. So, you know, I think if you can do it, and that's why, frankly, you know, the filibuster is a vestige of segregation, and I like President Biden's idea of making Tom Cotton stand in the well for 30 hours without going to the men's room. I like that idea. I think we should make them do that if we're going to do something on the filibuster and make it harder for them to do it. And so, because I think also we have to, you know, our poor, as I say, this is a Democrat, our poor Republican friends, they're trying to figure it out. And some of them would really like to vote for this. But my goodness, you know, you make $175,000 and you don't want to lose to a Trump Biden in the primary. And I still have kids to put through college. So, you know, I understand their pain. I understand their pain. So, you know, if you need one or two on an issue, you figure out how to bargain for it. And there are some on different issues who are, I can't figure Mitt Romney or Susan Collins or anybody out, but certainly on one issue, seems to me you could pull over one or two. And I like hanging the threat of the repeal of the filibuster over their head as well. But I just, if it's all Democrats passing votes, great.
Okay, is there anybody besides Bob who has a question? Only because Bob just asked the last question. So Peter, go ahead.
So Scott, the Republicans have just reaccepted the use of earmarks in legislation. Could that be the thin edge of the wedge in terms of driving, I wouldn't say bipartisanship, because that is at best unlikely event, but a thin edge of the wedge in terms of vested self-interest to drive compromise?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, when I went out on my own and actually had an office in DC, and we did some lobbying for different clients, I would give my list of my requests for appropriations to Ted Kennedy. And Ted Kennedy would, about this time of year, a little earlier, and Ted Kennedy would come out, would give me a call about this time of year, and he would say, Scott, I got the good news on, I got to the hospital $1 million, and I got and so it was a very, and I could make the argument when I worked for Senator Kennedy and when I worked for a member of Congress before that, that they know best kind of the needs of the district. I mean, we wouldn't have had the big dig, we wouldn't have had all of the investment that we have in life sciences and whatnot if it wasn't for earmarks. So I can make a legitimate case for it. But what does Kevin McCarthy have to give to his caucus? Nothing. But if Marjorie Taylor Greene needs a bus station in her district, Kevin McCarthy can give her an earmark or not give her an earmark. And I think now Nancy Pelosi is brilliant at keeping control of her caucus. And she does it without earmarks. But Kevin McCarthy, I think doesn't know what to do when he wakes up in the morning. And then he's got nothing to give. So I think it would.
How about the leadership in the Senate?
In what way?
In keeping control of the caucus.
Oh, I would love to, on my spare time, just sit in Chuck Schumer's office and just watch him operate, and Mitch McConnell for that matter. I'll get a big bowl of popcorn and just sit there and just watch them go through it. The Senate obviously is a whole different, so they've got way more controls over their caucus and how they do it. And even to the point where, will any of us ever forget Mitch McConnell staring down John McCain when he gave the thumbs down, and John McCain doing it right in front of them? So that shows you that except for those exceptions, somebody leaving the reservation or whatnot, they're pretty tightly controlled. And obviously those, senators are national figures. So it's a whole different, other than Ed Markey, every one of them wants to be president of the United States, I think. So maybe not Mitch McConnell either, but yeah, that's and then the dynamic in the play. I mean, I will just as a Democrat take Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi any day of the week over Kevin McCarthy and Mitch McConnell.
Yeah. Let's see, did I see another hand there? Okay. Mark Davis, did you get your questions asked and answered? I don't see Mark anymore. Well, is there anybody else who has a question? We don't need to. There you are, Mark. Did you want to make sure that your question got addressed?
I put it in the chat, and I put it in the chat.
Okay.
Sort of a follow-up about the filibuster that Scott was talking about earlier, and
yeah,
relative to the Voting Protection Act, HR 1, turning into SR 1.
Yeah, my only, I think this too. I mean, frankly, with the with Harry Reid changing the filibuster rules on judicial nominations when they were holding up Obama's. Assuming that we can't figure out how to stay in power forever, what's the long view of this? My sense is that of sort of the people who've been around the Senate for a long time, the recognition of the filibuster and how it was used originally, how it's being used now is problematic, but there's probably a hope that the era will pass, and that then it becomes a needed check of things moving too quickly, either if the Republicans are in power or the Democrats are in power. So I can see as an institutionalist why you would think that it's a check, but it seems that to Peter's point, unless the Republicans started to show some effort to be willing to have some of these things come up, Chuck Schumer and the Democrats are going to be almost forced to amend the filibuster, I think. So I think right now it's a game of brinksmanship to see if they can get it. And I think, frankly, Biden didn't make those comments about how he's at a very high approval rating now. He's got some political capital to spend. Nobody really understands what the filibuster is. And I think they're trying to see if they can find some accommodation before they would have to take that step.
So if you think about it historically, the Senate was an artifact of concern about fears of protecting the interests of the minorities. Originally protect the interests of the smaller states against the larger states when the Constitution was written. And so the filibuster hangs off the side of that as an additional sort of check on the minority kind of thing. There's a certain redundancy associated with it. But it's ever since since the mid 80s, it has been expanded beyond its traditional base of withholding civil rights to withholding economic rights and all those other things. It strikes one as reformation of the filibuster is short of making crotchety old men stand in the well for 30 hours. It seems unworkable to reform it. There are certain institutions that just simply outlive their usefulness and can't be reformed, and this would strike me as one of those.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting, and one to kind of that a reality that we have now that I'll talk about a little bit is that I think they are. When you're in the institution and a great deal of the effort is to slow things down, to be deliberative about it, particularly in the Senate. I think they're looking for all tools, whether they're original or not, in terms of doing that. Particularly if you've got one side that's trying to stop or slow down as much as possible what the other side is. The other thing that's an outside force here, increasingly, is that 30% of people 25 and under aren't so sure democracy is great. They don't actually believe in democracy. They don't think it's working for them. So if you were born in the 30s or the 40s, 70% or higher believe in democracy, in our democratic institutions. 30% of people 25 and under don't. And it's an increasingly growing number. And frankly, it's not just young people too. You see it with Donald Trump and the phenomenon. Frankly, people who support Bernie Sanders, I use him as an example, people who want disruption to the system aren't big believers in democracy either because they don't think it's working. And it's not like they don't have a point. Ed Markey's ad for the Sunrise Movement ended with all due respect, ask not what your country can do for you. With all due respect, ask what your country's done for you. Ask what you can do for your country, what your country's done for you. And he wasn't wrong in that. I had this conversation with Congressman Moulton, and he said, I said, try to help me figure out what's going on. I said, I'm not quite sure what's going on, but I said, I will tell you this, that Donald Trump and others are perfectly happy that you serve your country, Seth. But what did your country give you back for that service? It certainly was different after World War II than it is now, in terms of the GI Bill, in terms of the support, in terms of those things. You kind of even get adequate VA support for the service you gave to your country in that way. So, and what Danielle Allen, the person we're talking with in the exploratory committee, the political theorist at Harvard, said that after the day after the 2016 election, she came into her classroom and to talk, and she wasn't going to teach, she was just going to let them talk about what had happened the night before. And she had barely gotten into the room, and one of her students stood up and said, "I am angry at you." And she said, she was taken aback, and she said, why are you angry at me? I didn't vote for Donald Trump. Your generation has let us down. Your generation has ruined our future. And so I don't know that it's shocking, but maybe not surprising that there's 30% of people who think maybe this democracy that you've got doesn't work and we should try something else.
you know, there is a question in the chat that it's going to change the conversation a little bit, but if HR 1 is passed, how does it work in relation to states' rights?
I don't know if somebody else has got a comment. I mean, I guess I would need to.
Alice, do you want to expand on that at all?
Well, the Article 1 of the Constitution gives the states the rights and the responsibilities of managing their elections. I mean, it was the first clause in the first clause of the Constitution, and so the states' rights people are saying, wait a minute, you know, Washington or the federal government should not be dictating the rights and responsibilities of the voters in the sovereign states. That's sort of the polarity of this question.
Mark Davis, I posed that question because I listened to the NPR talk for an hour with Representative Sarbanes, and the issue is the bill only applies to federal elections, not to local state elections. However, the who can be registered, who can register, when can you vote, can you have absentee ballots, all that kind of thing. And the states have always gone along and had virtually the same rules as the feds, because it would be incredibly complicated if there were two entirely different voting systems within a state. Who's registered? You know, you have two different voter registration rolls, you have elections on different days, etc. So whatever the feds set up, de facto becomes what all the states will do. So although the Constitution says the states determine it, the federal government can effectively set the rules for everyone.
Well, that wasn't always true. In the 1870s and 1880s, the states had different polling dates, different requirements for state elections. It was when the Garfield election went down and following the assassination of Garfield that there was a momentum to standardize. But in the 1870s into the 1880s, the state of New York had like 6 elections per year for different things and different poll lists. So it's maybe better today than it was, but it hasn't been universal in the past.
That's the ancient past.
Well, Mark has Lincoln on his side behind him, so you know, there's some weight there. Any other questions? Because we're getting to 8:39, and I don't know how much time you've blocked out for this, but are there any other?
I have just one more, Scott. When you report to your Blue Lab members that 30% of their cohorts question or don't believe in democracy, how do they react?
I think I'm afraid to ask them how they react. I don't know that they would disagree. I've got a son upstairs. I'm not sure he would disagree. So I think it's something that has to. And I guess I'll just expand a little bit on this. That as we've got this struggle between, I think right now, as I said, 3 parties: a Trump party, something of a Republican party, a Democratic party that's going through its own identity crisis, and the future hinges, I think, on these things in terms of what the modification is to participation. We saw great participation from young voters. We also saw increased participation from different categories of voters. But this is the risk we run, I think, is that of the top 50 wealthiest congressional districts in the country, we happen to live in one of them. They are represented by Democrats, almost all of them. So right now, the Democratic Party runs the risk of becoming an elitist, wealthy, extremely well-educated party. And in fact, Donald Trump made gains among African American men, among Latino voters along the border in Texas, among Cuban voters in Florida. And we run the risk of becoming really isolated in our wealthy enclave congressional districts, kind of talking amongst ourselves. And I think running the risk that we don't understand kind of what's wrong with the rest of the country. And that would be a losing strategy for Democrats. And so it also includes, Peter, to your point, and your daughter was an excellent Blue Labber and leader, is that we have to figure out how to, which is what we're trying to do in the Blue Lab, engage young voters, but in a way that's going to be transformative of the big issues that they're looking at, the wealth inequality, the climate change. When I teach at Stonehill, I love telling my students this fact. I say, do you know who spends the most lobbying in Washington? And they'll say, you know, the NRA or this or that. Realtors. Realtors spend the most amount of money lobbying in Washington. So when you, this spring, take your mortgage interest deduction on your home or homes, thank the lobbying of the realtors. And if you're under 30, the mortgage interest deduction isn't really a big thing. But saving the planet by passing the Green New Deal kind of is. And that's where they are. And so we run the risk that we alienate them and then they start to, you know, fight from the outside.
Yeah. Downing has a question.
Just going to comment that here in this state, the realtors were the biggest lobby against this climate bill that just got passed. And that's surprising because when I went to hearings as a climate activist, it was typically fossil fuel people from National Grid, Eversource, et cetera, who spoke against it, or from AIM, the Associated Industries of Massachusetts. But in fact, in the back, it was the heaviest lobbying going on against it was from Realty.
Yeah, and having you know, the Speaker Speaker Mariano had just been elected, and they were, when the threat of the veto, when the veto expectation came, they were the ones who had weighed in late with the governor, and we knew it was coming. And the conversation that the Speaker had with the Senate President, I wasn't there in the room for it, but I love the way it worked out, which is fine. He'll get it again, word for word, in the new session. And you know, a lot of power from the realtor, but you passed unanimously that first time in both the Senate and the House. So strong activism. Thank you for your activism on that, because clearly you beat those forces that were the realtors and others that were aligned against it and persuaded the governor to veto it.
So I have one. This is Peter again. I have one comment, and what Scott practices, especially but not exclusively in the Blue Lab, is participatory democracy. So the Blue Lab is a cohort of college students that coalesce 3 times a year, and they choose the candidates they're going to support, not Scott. And if they don't want to support a candidate, that candidate doesn't get supported by the Blue Lab.
It's very frustrating.
It probably drives you bonkers. It probably accounts for much of the gray hair in your beard, et cetera. But the fact of the matter is, it is magical to watch these kids debate virtually 24 hours a day of the relative merits and the strategies associated with it. It's an incredible institution. And this past year, he spun it up in North Carolina. And the magic that occurred with kids from Massachusetts and other places collaborating with kids from North Carolina, finding both differences and common ground, was just sort of a magical thing. And he has on the drawing board the idea of the Red Lab, which would be the equivalent for the Republican side of the equation. And I'm hopeful that he does spin that up.
Thank you very much, Peter. And boy, would that be an interesting adult program to have those kids on.
It would be, yeah, you'd love them.
I wanted to say my 30-year-olds also, one in particular likes Trump, but their expectations is they pay all this money in, but there is no shot that they're ever going to get Social Security. It's going to fall apart before then. So that kind of feeds into Scott's theory that, you know, what's in it for them? They're putting money in that they will never see.
Okay, well, do we have a final question? Besides, I do see one in the chat. Is there, Eloise, go ahead.
Hi, Scott. I know, I'm not sure if this is on topic, but I wondered if you had anything to advise us in terms of voter suppression and all the efforts in that regard, because I think, you know, I'm trying to figure out where to put my efforts anyway in terms of helping
Yeah, I think I think Jean mentioned this. I would give every penny to Stacey Abrams and have her figure it out in the 50 states. But you know, so there's lots of effort that, I mean, it's heartwarming to me that every time a roadblock went up in a year that was throwing up roadblocks intentionally or just from the pandemic standpoint, the voter turnout across the country and in states like Georgia were truly stunning. And the pictures of people waiting in line for hours and hours and hours under threat of pandemic to do it is amazing. And it gives, it probably naively makes me think that they can throw up whatever roadblocks they want, in much in the same way they did in the civil rights era, whatever they want, and people will figure out how to get over them. One thing, that's not enough, but I also think that we need to put a lot more attention in two ways. One is the parties are every race is nationalized. So there's not that ability in a district to be able to take a look at the district. Going back to Seth Moulton, we ran an insurgent campaign. The minute he became the nominee, the Democratic Party insisted for money that you had to do things a certain way, their way. They came out of Washington that had no feel for the district. And it was a struggle to be able to do that. But both the Republican and the Democratic Party, to maintain control, do that. So one would be to get out to places where they aren't, and to help people and encourage them to run in one way and to be there. The other thing is too, I think we should look just to amend Peter's praise of the Blue Lab, which I appreciate. We were in South Carolina, not quite ready to go into North Carolina, but we were in South Carolina and Wisconsin and New Hampshire. And in South Carolina, you can see it. And they don't see a lot of Democrats in South Carolina. And even when we were going into Wisconsin, we got shut down by COVID. We had a meeting with Senator Tammy Baldwin, and she said, I love this grassroots effort because I'm at the top of the ticket. But if people are undermining the races at the bottom of the ticket, not helping people get elected to the state legislature, it's going to ultimately affect my ability to be reelected at the top of it. And then I'd look at states that we are close to electorally, but Democrats aren't in. Texas was a big focus. And I know some people from Belmont went down to Texas into certain races. That's the next. There are a couple states, South Carolina, there are a couple states on the cusp. And if you can flip those, you don't need to get rid of the Electoral College. We'll own the Electoral College as we already own voters as Democrats.
Well, that's a very cheerful note. And I would say, Alice, do you have another question before we wrap it up?
I mean, Scott was talking about Stacey Abrams. Every time I've heard Jamie Harrison, I felt very encouraged. He's a 50-state guy. I think he and Abrams will be a powerful combination. And I feel optimistic that the DNC may finally do something positive.
Hear, hear.
Okay, well, Monty, you have your hand up. You need to unmute yourself. You didn't get a chance the last time, but I'm going to give you this final word.
Final word. Well, Scott, I'm interested in your projection about this. One of the things that I find so exciting about the passage of the COVID relief bill is that it's really an example of big government doing something really big that really helps people's lives. And for decades, there's been a concern about big government, and starting with Reagan, and government's not the solution, it's the problem. And Scott Walker capitalizing on people's fear of big government. And but here's an example of Biden banking on big government to do something big in response to something big that actually is going to really help people's lives. So I'm just wondering what your thoughts about is there a hope for big government doing big things, or is this kind of a one-off?
Yeah, I agree with you. I think there is. I mean, this was big. This was big. But we've always had big government. Ronald Reagan had big government, and if you were a defense contractor, you did extremely well with his version of big government, or if you were in certain sectors. I run a business. It's an S corporation. Donald Trump was very good in his 4 years to my business. Very good. to my business and to business with the tax cut and whatnot and tax policy. This time, Joe Biden, I think I get nothing out of this, but that's exactly to your point. Finally, it's not to people who don't need the assistance. It's to people who do need the assistance. And that hasn't been. I mean, I'm always amazed when you go out for a hike and you're walking on trails that were constructed during the Great Depression by people in the different programs, and long lasting, and here they are. And we have that ability to be able to do that again. Huge investment in infrastructure, in the structural things, because apparently now the Republicans don't care if you spend money, which is awesome, so that we can just start doing that in that way. And I don't know if people are on Twitter. I follow Richard Nixon on Twitter. I encourage everybody to follow Richard Nixon on Twitter. He's amazing for somebody who's been dead for 20 years in terms of his prescience and stuff. But whoever's got the account is just a brilliant commenter, wearing his sort of Richard Nixon hat, if you will.
Oh, I think Scott is breaking up. We're not getting a signal.
Yeah, I got him.
Yep. Sorry.
Okay.
It was when I invoked Richard Nixon's name.
I think that was it.
Yeah. But if anyone's on Twitter, follow him. The Tweet of God is actually pretty good too. But the Richard Nixon is great, and his comment feels a little weird talking about a guy who's no longer alive. But he said, when the huge expansion comes, that's when people will realize how impactful this is, and I think that's right.
Okay, Bob, you have the very, very last word, because this is going to be the very last question. Bob?
Trump used the American Treasury to buy votes when he paid farmers in the Midwest for their losses, when he decided that he wouldn't ship soybeans and other products to China. Heather Cox Richardson reported today that 1/3 of the American agricultural income last year was attributed to the money that the federal government subsidized American farmers. That is not a sustainable policy. But I don't know how anyone's going to get out of it. Do you have any ideas?
I don't. I mean, no. Except to say that I do think that the. I mean, we've all watched Joe Biden for years, and I have always liked Joe Biden. I've supported other people when he's run for president, but you do, when you take that oath of office, other than his immediate predecessor, you do become a different person. I mean, I think his immediate predecessor became a different person if you could become a worse person than he was in those things. There's lots of, it's a whole separate thing. But I think Joe Biden, just seeing him in the way that he conducts himself is so presidential, I hate using that word when we're talking about it, but he's a different person. And I think if we're going to do it in whatever way we're going to get underlying policies that relates to agriculture and other things in place to transform that, he's got the ability to be able to do that with a great cabinet as well. I also like the fact, just one last thing, that he got off the airplane today with the vice president, and just being clear about the partnership that they're developing in that way. I can't remember the last time a vice president walked off the plane with the president, except in extreme circumstances, but I think that's the way everything he's doing. I'm except having his dog bite guests, I'm very impressed with.
And on that note, I have to say, you've given us more than an evening's worth of material to think about. And the good news is it's recorded, and we're going to be putting this on YouTube, and you can go back to it, because if there's anything that you didn't understand, you have another chance. So, and I do hope that it is my fond hope that we can get Scott to come back again, and we'll just keep on doing programs with Scott as long as he has the energy and the eagerness to do this.
I have an easier way. I've got dirty pictures on Scott, so anytime you want him back, just call me and I'll
all right,
I'll invoke it.
That.
So
Thank you,
I'm glad we end with a little fake news. So that
Right. So thank you very much, all of you, for being here, and especially to Scott. Let's give him a round of applause so he can hear it.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay.
thank you very much.
Thanks.
All right. Thanks again, Scott.
Thank you.
And we hope to see you soon.
Great to see everybody.
Thank